some other states, and it was just funny. They were the final four.
Yeah. Do you all remember what you were doing at this time a year ago?
And I went to Hot Springs to go see my cousins. And then I remember saying, well, if everyone does what they need to do, this should be done probably by October. Obviously, that was not the case, but oops.
Yeah, so on the 12th of March last year, 12th of March was a Thursday. And I was teaching a Tuesday, Thursday class that was meant in the morning. And in the morning, somebody said, well, do you think we're going to close? Do you think, and some of the people in the class thought no. And I mean, several just were like, why would we close? And about 3 o'clock, we got the announcement. Around the same time, I got an announcement from where my mother's assisted living place saying that they weren't going to allow anybody in. And they were implementing a new pandemic protocol. And about the same time, I got this email from my son's college saying they were going to go, the next week for them was spring break, and they were going to go home. They were going to send the students home for spring break, and they were going to make it 2 weeks long. And then they'll come back in 2 weeks after, I guess, everything's all fine. So, and even I thought at that point, well, I think that's a little optimistic.
Yeah. At the time I was working, I did deliveries for Best Buy, appliance deliveries. And we were at our final stop for the day before in the company. We get a call from our manager, like, where are you guys? Get out of there now, blah, blah, blah. We're shutting down. And I'm like, wait, what? And they're like, yeah, no, we're canceling appointments for now until we have like an actual protocol in place. And I'm already in the middle of like hooking up this washer and dryer. I'm like, well, I'm already here and I'm halfway done. I'm going to finish this job. So this poor old lady is not left with just a mess in her laundry room.
Really?
So I did that. And then, it got ridiculous because then later on, they're like, okay, well, we're going to deliver stuff, but we're going to leave it outside their door. And I'm like, how do you expect a 60-year-old, 50-year-old like woman or anyone to drag a fridge through their house? Like, you are insane. Like, we got to think of a better way. But I remember just the scramble to try to figure out the new normal. So
yeah,
without being really disruptive, but yeah.
Well, and they didn't know as much information. For the first 3 months, I scrubbed everything that came into the house.
Oh, if you were coming like near my house because we have a cancer patient, my mother-in-law living with us, you were getting sprayed with Lysol. I didn't care like how clean you were. You were not getting near us unless you got sprayed down.
So you were lucky that you had Lysol.
Oh yeah, no, buy in bulk always. And we had so many cans of stuff left, and I'm like, well, doesn't it make you feel good that we typically buy in bulk now? We're we fine. Don't even worry about it.
Really, because I did not have any Lysol, and around the time I'd gone to Target to look for some Lysol, and there are these Lysol like the wipes.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I don't really need those. And I didn't buy any. And then the next time I thought about it, I tried to find them, and they were like $20 a tube. It was ridiculous. So.
Oh man, the price gouging, the overreaction to buy, I don't know why, toilet paper of all things. I mean,
I remember that.
Yeah, and I'm just like, I feel really bad for the person who like waits till the last roll to buy toilet paper right now. Like, that sucks so much.
Yeah, I remember my husband and I, we decided on a strategy one day that we would go to 2 different Walmarts to get household supplies. And we'd go early, because they had a time for older people to go. And it was already decimated. So I was like, how are they, they, in the toilet paper aisle, they had a person stopping you and letting them go in one by one. And you could only get one toilet paper package, one white pack, one, I don't know.
And then I remember delivering a refrigerator to someone. It was just a younger couple, and they're like, "Yeah, our refrigerator right here is sounding really funny right now." And I'm like, "What?" And I'm like, "Well, let me look at it." And I open it up. It's like filled to the brim of like frozen. I'm like, "Well, no wonder. I mean, you need to vent it still. Yeah, don't load it up that way." And they're like, "Well, we don't know what's going to go on." They said stock up. I'm like, "It's not as bad as you think it is. You're actually disrupting the supply chain, if anything." And I don't know, it made me laugh a lot.
Yeah, there were some humorous things. Of course, my mother went into the hospital on March 13th, which was a Friday, and she never came out. And she went in for something else, and then she died on May 16th. So she spent those 2 months in the hospital. She got COVID, but that wasn't what killed her. But it was the COVID thing that killed her because
Well, weakened everything at that point.
Right. I mean, well, because, and I so wish that when she went in the hospital for an infection, cleared the infection, they were sending her home to, well, they were sending her to rehab, because that's what you always do with Medicare patients. You know, their Medicare policy gives them a certain amount of days of rehab. So you send them to a nursing home for rehab. And I so wish that I had somehow known more than I knew, and said, nope, she needs to go back home to her apartment. And because the apartment complex, it's a independent assisted living complex, they didn't have any COVID cases because they didn't let anybody in and out, and they just ate inside. And oh well. So if you're in creative nonfiction, I'm hoping everybody will, you know, come up with good stories about what happened. And so
Yeah,
anyway, it is a good thing for thinking about Kairos, though, because all sorts of communication and situations changed that caused the rhetorical products of the time to change. And like what Micah said, looking back to a year ago Facebook posts, they didn't age. I mean, that's just pointing out how tied to the Kairos, the timing, a rhetorical piece is. And of course, one of the things we say about great literary things is that they're timeless. And what we're saying about that is somehow that they're not tied to the immediate Kairos. And so you can talk about some things as being timeless, that transcend in immediate moments. But then there is something about them that may apply regardless of what the actual time and situation is. And that's what we say is something that's, you know, great literature, or that's one definition, to think of a stasis definition. One argument about what counts as great literature, which is a defining stasis or stasis of definition, is that it transcends time. Definitions are a really important type of stasis for a lot of things, especially when we're talking about art and cultural artifacts and products. So, okay. I will talk about the exam next class, but not everybody has actually finished it. So I accept things late. I take a few points off, and but we'll talk about it. But basically, people did really well. It seems like people mostly got the points, and the points as in got the points that I was trying to make. And so I think that's really good. I know sometimes it's hard to sort of stop and really sift through the logic of statements. But hopefully you can do that more. You now have some concepts to think about to help you stop and understand. So, for example, stasis theory, when you're in an argument, it really does help. And this would apply to, everyday pedestrian things like arguing over who is supposed to take out the trash, which is a stasis of policy, like who is supposed to do this. But it may come up with lead to stasis of definitions of, what are gender roles supposed to be, and how does it come into it? And so being aware of those kinds of types of debates, different stasis that people debate, may be helpful even in everyday life as well as your professional life as rhetoricians or writers or designers or teachers or whatever. So let me start by asking, does anybody have any questions?
I had a question, and it's sort of unrelated, but I know that there was something sent out about advising and like, check who your advisor is. And like mine still says like no advisor selected or something like.
So I'm really unsure how we handle advising in my department. The default is to always go to the chair, which is Dr. Joyce Carter. I think the other process is to go to a faculty member and ask them to advise you. So, I'll be happy to advise anybody, although I'd be happy to advise anybody. I know the rules. I know a lot about the requirements of the university because I've unfortunately been on the faculty senate where we invented all these rules. So, and of course I know lots of useless random things about writing and what you can do. So, so for advising, if there's nobody that's been assigned, either go to Dr. Carter, her email is JL Carter. And in fact, and she has this cool scheduling thing, or ask a faculty member for help. And does anybody know when the schedule actually opens?
I thought it was at the beginning of April or end of the month, something like that. I guess I don't have to do that as long as I don't screw up the semester, but
well, are you going to graduate?
Yeah, as long as everything goes correctly. Yeah, I keep getting hounded that I should go apply for graduate classes, but I need a break. Otherwise I'm going to lose interest and then I'm going to start like half-assing everything. So yeah. I know myself, I need a break.
So are you thinking of coming back for the master's?
I want to. I have enough left in my GI Bill to pull it off, most of it off, and probably only have to pay a little out of pocket. So I mean, at that point, might as well, right?
Oh yeah, sure.
But also, I don't know. My sister and I have a horrible competition going between each other over who can outdo whom, and she doesn't have her master's, so I can get mine and therefore maintain the title of Golden Child.
Aaliyah, you're not getting ready to graduate yet, are you, or are you? Uh-oh. That's the trouble with loss of video. Morgan, are you ready to graduate?
My advisor said that I could graduate in December if I take summer classes.
Are you going to?
I think I will.
You think?
Mhm.
Yeah. They are actually having a sort of pre-recorded virtual graduation this term.
Yeah, that's different. I mean, it's better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, for some people, I mean, for me, it's a big deal to be able to go walk and do all that stuff. So I'm happy something, you know. I took the scenic route, so I really, you know, I want the whole thing.
I wonder if you can choose to wait for the next. I think they were talking about having an option too for the next time when we do finally have a real graduation, letting people who had graduated during the pandemic time
Have their moment.
you know,
Yeah.
participate. I think there was something like that. Yeah. As faculty members, you know, we're supposed to go to graduations. We're supposed to go to at least one a year. And they're a little boring from our perspective, except that it is kind of amazing sitting down there. So it's in the Jackson Stevens thing, and we're, you know, everybody's down on the floor, and all around you are all these families and cheering, and it really is kind of cool when a person goes across the stage and, you know, from some little corner of the auditorium, there, you know, there goes up this big cheer. So I do really actually like it, and I love seeing students that I've had, you know, walk across. And the rest of the time, since the reason why it's boring is that 95% of the people going across the stage are not people that I ever taught or dealt with. So then I spend time evaluating the shoes that go by. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Okay, so this is all distraction. Okay, so that was the last announcement, was that there was a new test, and I'm hoping everybody got that new test. I will be creating weeks, I think, well, let's just look at this way. My computer is lurching. Okay, so here's where we are. You know, I've been doing a color coordination for the units. So the structure unit is a 2-week unit. We're going to focus on the psychology of form and sort of the first kind of ideas in the chapter this week. This week, you are also supposed to be thinking about your the piece that you're analyzing rhetorically in your blog, and start thinking about basically all these ideas that we've done so far with that piece. In class, we're going to talk a lot about applying the idea of structure, what we're dealing with now, particularly. And since it's kind of a short unit, there will be a quiz the week after spring break on structure. The second week of the unit, the week after spring break, the focus will be on this classical template. And so that's where we are today. Any questions just about this, where we are in class? Hide floating meeting chat. Wait. Or I don't get that. Yeah, just do it that way. So I picked out a new template for my PowerPoint. We are, the chapter is called Arrangement. And, or I'm sorry, it's called Structure. In the traditional rhetorical terminology, that's called arrangement. That is, how do you arrange a speech from a traditional view? And the Greek and Romans talked about the canons of rhetoric. Basically, those are the big categories of rhetoric that you would think about. Invention is what we might call pre-writing these days. That is, how do you find out material? Arrangement is how do you organize the material? Style is the linguistic use of just the language of the rhetoric, including, say, rhetorical figures, use of metaphors, uses of structural language, things like repetition. And then, because the traditional rhetoricians were interested in speech, not writing, they also dealt with memory and delivery. And memory pertains to how do you remember the speech so that you can deliver it, because writing was very rarely used at that time. And they say that this was all a oral culture. And as an oral culture, there was a lot more importance played on memory because people weren't writing things down to let writing be their remembering tool. And so people became much better at remembering things. And so some of the early rhetoricians spent a lot of time talking about strategies for remembering things. As rhetoric has moved through the ages, and we've developed all these additional technologies for delivering, then, gosh, there's somebody who just rang the doorbell. I'm going to have to take a stop to make sure it's not something important. So
it's Jay. I just now got here. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. I thought it was my doorbell. As we move through the ages and new technologies are developed so that rhetoric is not just an oral production, memory seems to maybe play less of an importance. But one of the things that's happened is that rhetoricians sort of restyle the concept of memory. And and may talk about things like when somebody, well, has anybody taken a usability class, taken the usability class?
I'm taking it right now, actually.
Okay, so how does memory play into that at all, to usability of something?
Like, as far as going from step A to B and then repeating it afterwards,
Yeah,
what you're getting to. I mean,
that's one way.
I guess it depends on the way the instructions are actually written to get that person to that point. I mean, if they're backwards or out of sequence, you're not gonna really memorize the process too well, or you'll just get stuck, or you'll be like me and you'll just throw it to the side and say, forget it, I'm moving on.
Right. And one of the ways to think about it too is to think about what somebody already knows, what's in their memory. And so that you can rely on that as you move on. I was reading about document design yesterday for another class, and I was reminded of a quote by this guy Nielsen, who's one of the usability and document design people. And he says, one of the principles of website design is that people look at your website from the lens of other websites. Now he puts it in a more pithy way, which is people go to other websites, basically. And that's a basic principle of website design. And the idea is that their expectations about what to have in any piece of rhetoric, in this case, he's talking about a website, are built upon their experiences at other websites. So if you try a strategy that is totally new and different than any other website ever provided, your chances are you're going to lose your viewers because they're not going to know where anything is. We could say the same thing about teachers. If a teacher tries to design a Blackboard course shell, totally different from the way any other person designs a Blackboard course shell, they're not going to, the students are going to be so confused, they're not going to know where to find things. I was thinking about that just the other day when I was looking for a pan in the kitchen. For some reason, my husband decided to put it totally somewhere else where we don't normally put it. And because it was in some place that we don't normally put it, it took me forever to find it. And normally, of course, in my memory, there are, I know where to put it, and then I can, where it is, and then I go locate it. So like if you're looking in a book, this is where some genre expectations comes in. Because you've experienced a particular genre multiple times, you know what to expect from that genre. And so it's because it's in your memory banks. And so you don't have to process things as much. Once wrote an essay about McDonald's and about one of the things I liked about going to McDonald's was that there were so few choices. They were always the same. I knew exactly where to go. I didn't ever feel uncomfortable. This was before the pandemic, of course. And, so, there was like minimal bandwidth being used in my brain in going to McDonald's, and, whatever else was going on in my brain could function more. So memory, we can start thinking about in a lot of interesting kind of ways as we move into a more modern age. But in the traditional rhetoric, memory meant memorizing your speech so that you could give it in a way that was memorable, maybe. And then the fifth canon is delivery. And again, that is something that is specific to the oral situation, so that there are some rhetoricians, especially as you get into the 17th and 18th century, where the focus of the whole kind of instruction in rhetoric is not so much the content, but how you deliver it, how you use your hands. And there are textbooks that were written for people to show people how to stand, you know, where to move your hand, what kind of thing means something, what kind of stance or facial expression or movement will be more likely to appeal to the audience and what won't. And that kind of thing seems kind of odd to us, partly because we don't have a real emphasis on an oral delivery system anymore. But if you think about, again, how as we move through the time of, and all the technologies that have developed to produce rhetoric, delivery is kind of a pretty interesting thing. So when you change, for example, from oral to written rhetoric, it allows for different kinds of strategies. If you have an entirely oral rhetoric, you have a limit to how much length you can ever do, because you have to remember what you're doing, and the person reading or watching has a limit to how much time they can give to just sit there and listen to you. And so when you move to a written oriented culture, that allows for a whole bunch of different kinds of pieces of rhetoric. So you start getting long things because writing enables you to keep things long. You start getting, when you get into the Middle Ages and the development of the printing press, then you start getting things like how the visual layout of the printed page can reflect something that's in there. And so that's one of the things that's kind of fun in the Middle Ages, is the use of all this fancy calligraphy and art and all this stuff to emphasize or de-emphasize things. And now that we've gotten into this age of technology, every technology enables and constrains what you can do with it. So if you have, if somebody has invented the moving picture show, then there is this new technology, a new forum, to use the term they talked about earlier, of the movie, that technology both enables and constrains what people can do. It is a linear technology, so it leads to a lot of storytelling. So we have movies that are sort of a linear storytelling kind of process. When we moved into the internet and all the amazing technology that allows this interaction of things, then that technology has now enabling and constraining what can be done and what cannot be done. And thinking about that is really thinking about the delivery, you know, so that the delivery mechanism for a piece of rhetoric, if it's a movie, if it's the internet, if it's a web page, if it's social media, those are all delivery mechanisms. and that constrains and enables certain kinds of things that you can and can't do. I've been using the term enable. There's a theory called affordance theory, which I think uses a term that I think is helpful, this affordance, AFFORDANCE. That is the idea that the rhetorical situation, which includes the technology that you're using to deliver something, affords certain things that you can and can't do. So, so there's an overview of the canons of rhetoric, and we are going to focus on arrangement. And arrangement ends up having to do, of course, with everything else. But I think in many ways, it particularly has to do with delivery. So how you organize things, how you structure things, you know, the order in which you put things definitely has to do with the delivery tool that you have. So quite obviously, if you're putting something in a website, you can do things with it that you could not do if all you have is the printed page. One obvious thing is the way that you can make links so that you can, you know, go back and forth between multiple different things. Whereas the printed page, if that's all you have, that kind of pushes you a little bit more towards a linear thing. I remember though, a book I once read about that was system theory that tried to kind of get that systemic interactive thing where they're basically with footnotes that led you to other pages. And so that you were constantly able to kind of move around, jump from one thing to the other. It was a little unwieldy though, you know, going through pages and going over to this page and then over that page. And, but it predated the internet. And so then you can see how a internet system can allow you to do this interaction much more easy. Creates some limitations too, because we all tend to get lost down rabbit holes at times. So the textbook talks about Kenneth Burke, who is a 20th century rhetorician who is pretty important. He talked about both rhetoric and literature. And he wrote a big book called The Rhetoric of Motives. And he also wrote a lot of shorter pieces, some of which I think are, you know, like life-changing, to tell you the truth. But he introduces this idea of psychology of form. So when we think about structure, we may think just about how do we organize something on the page if we're thinking about writing? You know, what goes first, what goes second, what goes third? And the focus might be entirely basically on the logos of what we're saying. So I'm going to write this, I'm going to write this, I'm going to write this, and I'm going to cut and paste and move it around, etc., because somehow that's better or worse. But Kenneth Burke said it's not about the piece of rhetoric that you're organizing. It's not the logos you're organizing, but rather what you're organizing is the audience's experience of some emotion. And this is, I think, a really important concept. And I will tell you that, you know, until I, you know, all the way through college, when I organized something, I basically just thought about organizing it in a way that appealed to me, that made sense, you know, according to whatever content I was trying to work with. And I was a literature major in college. And so basically almost every paper I wrote, looking back, was about my journey to understanding something about a piece of literature. And, you know, I would basically start by, this is an interesting image. What does this mean? Blah, 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 blah. And it would be a sort of a tracing of my growing understanding of some idea. And it never really dawned on me that what I was doing was actually writing something for an audience, or that I could have been doing was writing something for an audience. But what Kenneth Burke is saying is, you are writing something for an audience. And when you're thinking about organization, what you want to be thinking about is, how are you organizing the audience's experience of that? Let me correct this typo. Yet another reason I love Google things. So organization is about organizing the audience's experience of that information, not so much about the writer's experience. Although, there are things where that's important. So this is where all the things we've been talking about before come in. So basically, whenever you have a piece of rhetoric, if you think about the psychology of form, then what you're doing is you have this rhetorical situation and all the things that go into a rhetorical situation, the audience, the kairos, the exigency, that is the triggering thing. Before they read this, and I'll just talk about it as a piece of text, but understand that we can be talking about any type of rhetoric, a song, a video, a blog, a poem, a speech, all the kinds of things that you guys are talking about. Before they read it, they have this kind of knowledge and beliefs and attitudes, awareness, situation, the kairos, etc. And then what you're trying to do is, through the process of reading your text, bring them to an after state, a changed sense of knowledge, a changed sense of beliefs, a changed sense of attitudes or awareness. And that's really, if you think about it, that's the goal of organizing, that you have to think about what your audience knows ahead of time, what their beliefs are, what their attitudes are. And given that sense of what the before state is, you want to somehow use your text, imagine the arrow is the text, to get them to some after state. And so again, you see how arrangement has so much to do with everything else in the of the canons. So of course, then arrangement obviously has to do with invention as well. So you have to figure out, what does your audience know? And so then what do I need to include to get them to the point that I want them to be at the end of this rhetorical thing? This can be with text, as I'm saying, but a song. What does a person know before they hear a song? Well, they might know the singer. And so that knowledge of the singer leads them to all sorts of expectations about what that singer does. And they might have certain attitudes, say about, I don't know, country music. And maybe you're a country music writer and you want to convince people who aren't into country music that this is a cool kind of music. And so they have attitudes before, and you're going to somehow, as the process of the song, move them somewhere. And of course, at the beginning of any rhetorical situation or piece of rhetoric, they don't always know anything. I mean, you may be providing all new information. Ooh, I should have a slide for given new. So, Kenneth Burke, in explaining the psychology of form, says that another way to look at this is arousing and fulfilling of desires. And so one of the things about rhetoric is that the audience experiences it in a linear fashion. And so if you think about, you can think about it not just as a before and after kind of thing, where you're moving them from place A to place B through your rhetoric, but also as a linear kind of thing where each first step leads you to the next step, which leads to the next step. So I've tried to convey this in a very simple diagram so that when you first have the beginning of something, nobody is a blank slate. No reader is a blank slate. So if you combine this with my diagram from before, the reader knows certain things or doesn't know certain things. And so from your beginning point, you need to be thinking about how it leads to the next step. In the textbook, they talk about how, this is really obvious in a detective story. So if you're talking about a Law and Order section episode, every Law and Order episode starts the same way. There's some people that you don't really know. They're interacting in some kind of way. And lo and behold, they come upon a dead body or a crime or a serious criminal act. I guess that's the same thing as a crime. And then the next thing after da-da is you've got the detectives sitting there interpreting whatever just happened. And you as the watcher are led along with this. So you first get, like the detectives, you first see this evidence of a crime, often a dead body. And then you gather new information that leads you to questions. And then you gather new information that leads you to some answers, but leads you to more questions. And then gradually you come to an answer. And so the class, in some ways, the detective novel is the paradigmatic novel, because it's, there's a mystery. It hopefully inspires you to have a desire, which is to find out what the source of the mystery is. And then the whole novel, basically, if it's well done, will fulfill those desires. And all sorts of very traditional forms are set up that way. So the traditional romantic comedy form, like if you have a traditional movie like, well, I can't think of any at the moment. while you were sleeping, way back when email first started, and you get this man and woman and they are separate, and that starts the movie, and then that arouses your desire because you've seen so many of these genre, is at some point this man and woman are going to get together, then at some point they are going to be separated, and then at the end they will come together and there will be fireworks at the end. And so the whole process of the movie is basically, first introducing the characters. It's a romantic comedy, so that at first they're not going to probably be together. They're going to be separate. Then they're going to be sort of moving towards togetherness. Then there's going to be something that totally separates them. And then there's going to be something that finally brings you to the end. So this arousing and fulfilling of desires really is obvious when you're talking about fiction, whatever technology you're using, but you can also talk about it with technical writing. So if you're writing instructions, you need to figure out what it is that the audience needs at the beginning in order to follow the instructions step by step. And many instructions, that's why, starts with a graphic design of all the parts and all the sections. Why? Because this is necessary information to understand everything else that follows. And then if it's set up well, it will be set up in a way so that you get the right information that you need in order to go to the next step, and then in order to go to the next step. In my Rhetoric 3316 class, which is writing from the workplace, the first assignment was a complaint letter that people had to do. And some of the students had a really hard time thinking about how do you start this complaint letter? And they tended to jump right into the middle and say, let's say they were complaining about a product that wasn't working. So I'm writing about my phone that is not working. And you say, well, okay, who are you writing to? It's the Samsung support place. And you say, well, does the Samsung support place know who you are? Probably not. Do they know what kind of phone you have? Probably not. Do they know that you are actually a customer of theirs? Probably not. So there's a whole bunch of things that you need to tell them at the beginning in order for them to do anything further on. And we've probably all had the experience, like I get my drugs at Kroger Pharmacy. I have now learned that the first thing they ask is my birthday. So my natural tendency is always, hello, this is my name. I'm here for a prescription for so-and-so. They don't care about my name. They want to know my birthday because that's how it's organized. So I've now learned that if I am going to Kroger Pharmacy, the first thing that I have to do is tell them my birthday, and then tell them my name, and then tell them why I'm there. It just makes it more efficient. But if you're writing to somebody who doesn't know anything, you've got to figure out what exactly it is that you need to tell them so that they can help you along the way. And this is actually a pretty complex kind of process sometimes. If you have a very complicated problem that you want to deal with, your tendency might be to go into all the very long details about what happened. And that is not necessarily helping that reader go from their before situation of knowing nothing about who you are to the after situation, which you hope is to solve the problem that you have. So it becomes an interesting rhetorical problem of how do you explain what you need to explain at the beginning in, you know, workplace writing or technical writing or any kind of sort of practical nonfiction, technical, professional kind of writing situation, because you can't write about everything. You can't organize everything. And so if you think about organization more as moving people from one step of knowledge and understanding and attitudes to the next step of understanding and knowledge and attitudes to the final step of knowledge and understanding and attitudes, then you can figure out how to actually go about organizing. So would anybody like to think about how your particular piece is an example of arousing and fulfilling of desires? That is, how the structure has some kind of psychology of form?
I will.
Okay.
My piece is about James Baldwin's letter to his nephew. And it starts out, James is telling his nephew about his grandfather, whose nephew never knew. And then he goes on to talk about his nephew's dad and how his dad was when he was a baby, and then a boy, and then a man. And then he sort of brings it all together as it relates to his nephew.
So what is sort of the psychology of form that you're seeing happening there?
Well, they all there's common ground with the nephew and his father and his grandfather. They all have things in common. Okay,
so he wants to, his overall point that he's trying to make is that there's common ground among the four of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but the nephew at the beginning doesn't know that much about the grandfather, or if he does know about him, it's from the perspective of a child to a grandfather. It's not the perspective of a peer. And same thing about his father. And so Baldwin decides that it's important to track all these stories about the father and grandfather of the nephew to lead to the point that he's trying to make.
Exactly.
So what comes first? Well, he decides his nephew doesn't know about this stuff, so he's moving in that direction. Yeah. And it would be a very different thing. There are other ways to have gone about doing this, but it's his thinking about his audience, knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, and understanding helps him structure it. I mean, he could have decided not to deal with the personal stories at all. He could have just dealt with the topic he was trying to express.
And he may have in the previous 4 versions. He said he'd torn the letter up, he'd written it and torn it up 5 times. So it'd be interesting to know what he wrote those previous times
So
and how he
Logo,
organized it.
but you know, the decision to use the stories of his father and grandfather, of his nephew's father and grandfather, logos, ethos, or pathos, which one is most relevant there? Why use stories of parents and grandparents?
Well, that's a hard one. I'd almost say ethos, because probably pathos, but ethos is really strong.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but and probably when I was younger, it didn't matter. But as I got older, finding out more about my parents and their parents, it just was you know, it was important, you know, because I knew them only as adults. In case of my grandparents, I knew them only as very distant, old adults. And so it's almost like I don't know, maybe it's just me, but maybe it's a very common thing to want to know about, you know, what they were like when they were, what did they experience? You know, what is this, what is the background to how they are now? And so anybody else have some ideas about psychology of form? And the piece of rhetoric they're looking at? These games people are doing. How does form play in a game?
Well, I know with the one I'm doing, God of War, it's like it kind of starts, like it sets up the characters and the situation, and in this case, you don't get all of the background information, but like, you know, you start to, you know, you're curious, like, okay, what's going on here? And
So that arousing and fulfilling of desires. So it's trying to make you curious. If you don't find the characters interesting at all, you may not want to play the game.
Funny you should say that. So in the one I'm writing about, and the game I'm writing about, there's a point, like, you know who the villain is. Well, in one character's eye, this is the villain. And, you know, as a player who played the last game, you hate this person so much. So when the game switches you to play as the villain for the other half of the game, who you is a villain in your eye, you're like jarred by it. You're like, oh, screw this. And you intentionally like harm this character just for your own amusement for a second. But as you go on in the game, you understand that character. This character gets developed like really good. So you almost feel attached to them by the end of it, even though they did something, you know, pretty horrible. But I don't know, you see them in a different light, and I think that was well done. It kind of messes with you because, you know, you're still attached to the old characters from the first game, but with this new one who is, you know, a villain in your original character's eyes, she's not really the villain though, per se. I don't know. It's hard to explain. I'm trying to like figure out how to write that, but
So that's very clever on their part, you know.
yeah.
But it's also very profound, you know. I mean, it makes me think of a saying that somebody said, don't judge somebody's outsides by your insides. So that when you see a person, when you get to know a person, you only get to know their outsides and you don't know what's motivating them and conflicting them, and and so you may really dislike that outside, or you only may see that outside and think they're superficial, and whatever. Because that inside yourself, you're so much more complex and interesting and whatever. And at least to some extent, your motivations. And so it's kind of putting you in that situation of, here you've been judging this terrible villain from the outside, and then it's forcing you, flipping you, and making you think about this villain from the inside, which is, there's so many situations in our lives where we get to know somebody, we realize they're not what we originally thought they were, even if they're not villains that are whatever and superheroes, just everyday kinds of things. That's really cool. But so it's totally, I mean, one way to talk about it is how the psychology of form that they're, what they're doing. So they're messing with you by putting it in this order, by making you go through in the first game, does everybody play the first game first, or are they totally independent?
I mean, to really appreciate the story, you would want to play the first game first. I don't think I know anyone who didn't play the first game first and then just play the second one first. I don't know. I don't know anyone who's done that, but even if they did, I mean, it's a good story standalone, actually, even if you didn't have because it gives you some of the backstory from the first game. So, I mean, you could walk into the second game and never play the first game, and you really wouldn't miss a lot.
So when you're talking about that, what you're talking about is that psychology of form is, so they're not thinking not only about the form of each individual piece, each individual game, each individual artifact, but how they all structure together. And whenever you have some kind of series of some kind, that becomes one of the questions, is how can you make it a standalone, or and what sort of background stuff do you do for people who are seeing this for the first time? But you don't want to give too much because you don't want to bore the people who've already seen the first thing. So, or played the first thing. So, all of this is, this whole question of structure becomes a thinking about a linear process that you're doing with your audience. And then, of course, any game automatically has the arousing and fulfilling of desires. So, there's a goal, and you're trying to achieve the goal. And hopefully, if you're successful, you will achieve the goal at the end. Questions about that? So, as you go through the day and all the pieces of rhetoric that come across your purview, think about how there's a psychology of form in them. And as I said, this applies to literature, this applies to games, it applies to a letter, technical writing,
Politics.
And if you were in a speech class, you probably, I think some of you were required to take speech. It's not required anymore. You probably would have heard, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them again. That's the basic structure of a speech. And that's exactly this idea of arousing and fulfilling of desires. So you tell them what you're going to tell them, you set up their expectations that this is what that you're going to tell them. Then you tell them, and then you go back and connect back. I find that a really good concept in thinking about all of this is what's called the given a new contract. And I will talk about that a little bit on Wednesday. So with that, I think if nobody has any questions, I think I'll say goodbye. Yes, no. Okay. I'll see you Wednesday.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.